She came every morning at exactly 7:15. Not a minute late. Never more than a few words. Always the same order, honey, cinnamon pastry, and always the same table. The one beside the window where the morning light came in at an angle and turned the steam from a coffee cup into something almost golden. The man behind the counter had never asked why. He had learned not to ask why about most things. She disappeared one Tuesday without warning. No message. No explanation. Just gone. And the strange part, the part that made his chest do something he didn't have a name for, was that the chair remained untouched for 3 full days. As if someone had decided it should wait. It wasn't until he found a crumpled receipt tucked behind the register, her handwriting on the back, small and precise, that he understood she had never come for the pastry at all. Michael Carter woke at 4 every morning, the same as always. The alarm was a formality. His body had long since memorized the hour. The way a machine calibrates to a rhythm it cannot escape. He would lie still for exactly 30 seconds, listening to the quiet of the apartment above the bakery. Then swing his legs to the floor and begin. He was 34 years old. He had been running the bakery for 6 of those years, ever since his father left it to him in a will that contained more debts than assets, and a single handwritten note that said only, "Don't sell it. People need it." He had not sold it. He had not understood, at the time, what his father had meant. He was beginning to understand now. The bakery itself was not impressive by any definition a stranger would use. The front windows needed resealing. The tile on the left side of the floor had a crack running diagonally across it that Michael had been meaning to fix for 2 winters. The glass display case was polished to a shine every morning at 4:45, which was the one vanity he permitted himself. The rest was warmth and flour and the particular smell that had lived inside these walls for longer than he had been alive. He moved through the kitchen in the dark, the way his hands knew the order of things without his eyes needing to confirm. Flour, butter, the dough that had been resting overnight, covered with a damp cloth, patient as something that understood waiting. He worked quietly, because upstairs his daughter was still asleep. Ella Carter was 6 years old. She had her mother's brown hair but wore it in a style entirely, her own 2 uneven braids that she insisted on doing herself each morning, which meant they were never symmetrical, and she was always proud of them. She had a habit of sitting in the far corner of the bakery with a sketchbook propped against her knees, drawing pictures of things she observed: the pigeons on the ledge outside, the way the sugar crystals caught light, and the expressions of customers when they took their first sip. She did not speak to most of the customers. She simply watched them the way a small scientist watches an experiment she hasn't yet named. Michael carried the weight of her entirely. There had been a woman, Ella's mother, but that was a chapter that had ended quietly, without drama or resolution, simply with an absence that became permanent. He did not speak about it, and Ella was too young to have questions that had specific shapes yet. For now, there was just the 2 of them, and the bakery, and the mornings that smelled of warm bread, and the evenings that ended with Ella asleep on his shoulder, while he read to her from books she had already heard a dozen times. It was not a glamorous life, but it was a life. It held together. And in the years since his father's death, Michael had come to understand that holding together was not a small thing. There had been moments in the first year especially, when the debt was real and the ovens needed replacing, and Ella was still small enough that she cried in the night when he had nearly decided that his father had been wrong, that not everyone needed a small bakery, that the debt outweighed the warmth. He never quite got to the decision. He would fall asleep on the kitchen floor and wake up stiff and be back behind the counter at 4, and the morning would insist on its own ordinariness, and the decision would be deferred until it ceased to feel necessary. He had 2 employees who came in for the lunch hours: a college student named Jake, who was reliable in the way of people with no complications yet, and an older woman named Pearl, who had worked for his father before him and treated the premises with the proprietary affection of someone who had more history with them than the current owner. Pearl had a habit of adjusting things he had done and not telling him she had adjusted them, which he pretended not to notice, because some corrections are a form of care. The first customers arrived before 6, the early commuters who took their coffee standing at the small wooden counter by the door and never sat down. By 7, the morning regulars had begun to filter in the retired teacher, who always ordered the same bran muffin and asked about Ella's drawings, the 2 construction workers who came in from the cold with red hands and ordered enough to feed 4, the woman from the yoga studio across the street, who was always slightly breathless and always grateful. Michael knew all their orders by heart. He knew their names and their habits and, in some cases, the outlines of their lives. That was what happened when you stood behind the same counter long enough. People left traces of themselves, whether they intended to or not. And then, one morning in late October, a woman he had never seen before walked through the door at 7:15 precisely, stood at the counter without removing her coat, and said, "The honey cinnamon pastry, and a black coffee." Charlotte Bennett arrived the way a person arrives when they have made the decision carefully, and are not quite sure it was the right one. There was a hesitation in the movement, not uncertainty, exactly, but something more considered. She wore a dark charcoal coat over clothes that were clearly expensive in the quiet, understated way that didn't announce itself. Her hair was dark, and pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency over decoration. Her eyes, the color of deep water in late afternoon, moved across the space with the practiced assessment of someone who was accustomed to evaluating environments quickly and drawing conclusions that others would not arrive at. For several minutes. She was 32 years old, though Michael would not learn this until later. She did not look her age, or rather, she looked a particular kind of ageless that comes not from youth, but from discipline. The kind of face that had learned to carry its expressions lightly. She paid for the pastry and the coffee. She took them to the table by the window, the one that sat slightly apart from the others, the one that caught the morning light at the angle that made reading comfortable. She sat with the posture of someone who had been told, many times in their life, to sit up straight, and had internalized it so completely that it no longer required thought. She ate slowly. She did not look at her phone. She simply looked out through the glass at the street, and drank her coffee, and was still. She was back the next morning at 7:15, and the morning after that. By the end of the first week, Michael knew her order before she gave it. He had it waiting by the time she reached the counter. She noticed he could tell by the slight shift in her expression, something that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood, and she said, "Thank you," in the measured way of someone unaccustomed to small courtesies finding them unexpectedly pleasant. He did not ask her name. She did not offer it. She sat at her table. She ate her pastry. She drank her coffee. She watched the street. Except, and this was the thing Michael would think about later, she was not always watching the street. Ella came downstairs at 7:45 every school morning, hair in her uneven braids, sketchbook under one arm, and backpack under the other. She moved through the bakery with the proprietary ease of a child in her own home, which this was. She retrieved her breakfast from behind the counter, always the same, a small fruit pastry that her father had set aside, and went to her corner and began to draw. Charlotte Bennett watched her from the window table, not the way a stranger watches a child, not with curiosity or discomfort, but with something quieter and more internal, the way a person looks at something that connects to a memory they have not accessed in a long time. She never said anything. She was careful not to stare. But Michael, who stood at the counter and watched his daughter every morning with the vigilance of someone who understood that love and attention were the same act, Michael noticed. He noticed, and he filed it away in the part of himself that kept records of things he hadn't yet understood. The change happened gradually, the way all significant changes happen, not in a moment of declaration but in the accumulation of small details that only become a pattern in retrospect. By the third week, Charlotte began to stay past her usual departure time. She had always left at approximately 7:50, with the precise efficiency of someone operating on a schedule that did not tolerate deviation. But one morning, she was still at the window table when the construction workers arrived, and she looked up from the cup she had been cradling between both hands and watched them order with an expression that suggested she had briefly forgotten where she was. She began to stay until 8, then 8:15. Michael noticed, because he noticed everything. It was an occupational habit, and also, he suspected, a survival instinct developed over 6 years of raising a daughter alone, which required a particular kind of total attention that left no room for the ordinary inattentiveness of people who had backup. The morning she first spoke to Ella, it was over a drawing. Ella had been sketching the cracks in the tile. She had been fascinated by them lately, working on what she described as a map of broken things, and Charlotte had been watching from her table with that same quiet expression. Then she stood, brought her empty cup to the counter, and on her way past Ella's corner, she paused. "Is that the floor?" she asked. Ella looked up. She evaluated Charlotte, the way she evaluated everything, with calm, unhurried attention. "It's the crack," she said. "I'm making a record." Charlotte considered this. "Why a record?" "Because cracks are interesting," Ella said, with the simple authority of someone whose opinion on the matter is not under negotiation. "They show where something happened." Something passed across Charlotte's face. It was quick, and she controlled it immediately, but Michael caught it from behind the counter, the particular expression of a person recognizing, in a child's casual observation, something that has taken them 30 years to understand. "Yes," Charlotte said quietly. "I suppose they do." She returned to her table, but after that, she occasionally exchanged a few words with Ella in the mornings. Small things, unhurried, with the careful quality of two people who are each testing an unfamiliar form of trust. Ella accepted her with the matter-of-fact openness of children, who have not yet learned that connection requires justification. Michael began to look forward to 7:15 in a way he had not looked forward to anything in longer than he was comfortable admitting. He told himself it was the routine. He was a man who relied on routines. That was all. One morning he caught himself timing the dough so that he would be at the front counter instead of in the kitchen when she arrived. He caught himself doing it, and stood in the kitchen for an extra moment, flour on his hands, examining what he had just done. Then he went back to the counter, and when she walked in at exactly 7:15 and the bell above the door made its small sound, he was aware of a feeling in his chest that he had no business having, and could not quite convince himself to be sorry for. One afternoon, after the bakery had emptied and Ella had been collected by her school car, Charlotte stayed later than usual. She sat with a second coffee she hadn't ordered so much as accepted, when Michael offered it, which was itself a departure from her usual precision, and she looked at the bakery in the unguarded way of someone who has momentarily lowered a thing she usually carries. "Do you ever think," she said, not quite looking at him, "that a person can miss a place they've never actually belonged to?" Michael leaned against the counter and thought about it. "I think we carry a lot of places inside us that don't have addresses," he said. Charlotte looked at him then, not the evaluating look she used on the world in general, but something more direct and slightly startled, the look of a person who has said more than they intended and found, against expectation, that it was received. "That's yes," she said. "That's the right way to say it." She didn't explain. He didn't ask. But something in the air between them had shifted, the way air shifts before weather. She came back the following morning and the morning after that, and something had quietly changed in how she moved through the space. She no longer held her coat tightly across her chest while waiting for her order. She had begun to leave her gloves on the table rather than pocketed, a small signal perhaps unconscious of a person who has decided they are staying. She still spoke carefully, still offered only as much as she had decided to offer, but the silences between her words had changed their quality. They were no longer the silences of withholding. They were the silences of someone choosing the right thing to say, which is an entirely different kind of quiet. She did not come on Wednesday. Michael told himself it was nothing. People had appointments. Schedules changed. A CEO he had noticed the company name on her card once, the kind of name that appeared in the business section of newspapers, would have a life that created interruptions in routines that lesser commitments could not override. She did not come Thursday either. He arranged the morning pastries and thought about the 7:15 slot and told himself he was not watching the door. Friday. The table by the window sat empty. The morning light came through it at the same angle as always. The steam from the coffee urn moved upward in the same unhurried spiral. The table simply held the absence of someone who had, apparently, somewhere else to be. Michael carried Ella to school that morning with a fraction more quietness than usual. Ella, who noticed the texture of silences the way other children noticed loud sounds, looked at him on the walk and said, "You're doing the thinking face." "I'm always thinking," he said. "The different thinking face," she clarified. He made her a promise about after-school ice cream, which redirected her attention, and they walked the rest of the way in the comfortable quiet they had developed between them over years of being each other's primary company. He returned to the bakery and found it empty of the early rush. He stood at the counter. He looked at the table by the window. The chair was pushed in precisely, the way it always was when she left, because she always replaced it exactly as she had found it. Careful, deliberate, the movement of someone who has been taught, or has taught herself, to leave things as she found them. He thought, 3 days is not long enough to be worried. He thought, she doesn't owe me an explanation. He thought, something is wrong, Ella asked that evening, with the directness of children who have not yet absorbed the social convention that some questions are not supposed to be spoken aloud. Where did the window lady go? Michael was making dinner. He kept his eyes on the pan. I don't know, Elle. Did she stop liking the bakery? I don't think so. Did we do something? He turned to look at her then, because the question had a weight in it that he recognized the particular worry of a child who has already learned that people sometimes leave without explanation, and who has incorporated into her emotional architecture the anxious hypothesis that their leaving might be her fault. No, he said firmly. We didn't do anything. Ella accepted this, turned back to her drawing. Then, after a moment, the chair is still in the same place. I know. You didn't move it. He hadn't. He wasn't entirely sure why he hadn't. Perhaps for the same reason his father had never repainted the back wall of the kitchen, where Michael had measured his height as a child. Some things deserve to remain while a person figures out what they mean. The following morning, he moved through the pre-opening routine with a restlessness he couldn't account for. He checked the register. He checked the small security camera that pointed at the front door, a relic from a vandalism incident 2 years ago that he had kept running out of habit. He scrolled back through the footage, without quite knowing what he was looking for. He found something he wasn't expecting. Charlotte had been paying for orders in advance. Not just for the day, he could see it now in the transaction logs, which he had never previously examined with any attention, because who examined transaction logs when the daily amounts were what they were? She had been paying for 5 or 7 days at a time. Quietly, without making anything of it, he stood at the register for a long time. Then he walked to the table by the window, and in the narrow gap between the tabletop edge and the wall, tucked with the deliberate concealment of something that was meant to be found eventually but not immediately, was a folded receipt. He opened it. On the back, in her small, precise handwriting, "If I stop coming, it's not because I wanted to." He read the line 3 times. 4. He stood at the table by the window where she had sat every morning for nearly 2 months, and he held the receipt with both hands, and he tried to decode the grammar of what she had left him. It's not because I wanted to. The past tense construction of something she had written, perhaps, before it happened. A message written in advance, which meant the absence had been anticipated, which meant it was not an accident or a change of schedule, but something she had known was coming. He folded the receipt and put it in his shirt pocket. He started asking questions with the tools available to him, which were modest but sufficient. He was not a detective, and he had no particular access to information. But he was a man who had spent 6 years running a business, which meant he understood how to find facts when facts were necessary. He typed her name into a search engine. Charlotte Bennett. The results came back immediately. CEO of Bennett Harlow Capital Group, a mid-size investment firm with a reputation for institutional discretion that the financial press described, in profile pieces, as principled privacy and competitors described as stubborn opacity. Founded by her father, Robert Bennett, who had died 4 years ago. She had taken over at 28, which the press had treated as a story about inheritance and gender in equal measure, which she had apparently addressed by making the firm 20% more profitable in each of the 3 years following. There were photographs, industry events, a charity gala, one conference panel where she sat at the far end and looked like she was listening more carefully than everyone else. He looked at the photographs for a long time. She looked like herself. The same posture, the same quality of internal reserve, the same careful distance from the center of things. Recent results were sparse. The last appearance at a public event was 8 weeks ago, right around the time she had started coming to the bakery. After that, a brief press release from the firm's communications office noting that Miss Bennett would be stepping back from day-to-day leadership for a period of personal leave, with the COO assuming interim responsibilities. Personal leave. He read through several more results. A piece in a financial newsletter speculated about what the leave signaled: internal restructuring, a potential acquisition, or something more personal that the firm was not disclosing. The speculation was precisely calibrated to convey nothing while implying everything. There were rumors, in the comments of a financial forum, that she had been seen at Memorial Medical Center on 2 separate occasions, though the post's author acknowledged this was secondhand and unverified. Memorial Medical Center. He sat back, and looked at the ceiling of the empty bakery. He thought about a woman who paid for her pastries a week at a time, who left notes behind in case she couldn't explain in person, who looked at his daughter with the expression of someone recognizing something they had thought was gone from the world. He thought about what she had said. A person can miss a place they've never actually belonged to. He did not go immediately. He spent 2 days with the information, carrying it the way you carry something fragile carefully, with attention to each step. He asked his neighbor, a retired woman named Dorothy, who had watched Ella a dozen times before, if she could stay for an afternoon. Dorothy said yes without asking why, because Dorothy had the wisdom not to ask why about most things. In those 2 days, he thought about what it meant to act on information that had not been offered to him freely. Charlotte had left a note, but the note was a contingency, not an invitation. She had arranged her affairs with the evident intention of managing her absence cleanly, without requiring anyone to find her or follow her, or make the situation more complicated than she had already decided it needed to be. He thought about the way she sat with her coffee, the way she looked at Ella without looking at her, that careful sideways attention, the way she had said a person can miss a place they've never actually belonged to, in the voice of someone who had been holding that sentence for a long time before they found someone to say it to. She had not wanted to create a bond, she would tell him later. She had created one anyway. That was the thing about small bakeries on gray mornings. They had a way of making the things you intended to prevent happen quietly, while you were paying attention to something else. He drove to Memorial Medical Center on a gray Thursday, parked in the visitor lot, and sat in the car for a while. He was not a dramatic man. He did not rehearse speeches, but he needed to be clear, inside himself, about why he was here. He was not here to intrude. He was not here to make claims on someone who owed him nothing. He was here because a woman had sat at his window table for 2 months and left him a note that said she hadn't wanted to disappear, and he thought that deserved a response, even a small one. He found her through a combination of luck and the particular social grace that years of running a small business had given him the ability to ask questions of hospital staff in a way that conveyed genuine concern without triggering institutionnelle caution. A kind receptionist on the 3rd floor, responding to something in his expression that she apparently found credible, told him that Miss Bennett was in room 312 and that visiting hours ended at 6. He knocked twice before entering. She was sitting up in the bed, not lying in it, the specific posture of a person who refuses to be reduced to horizontal, who insists on remaining upright as a matter of principle, even when the body is in negotiation with something larger than principle. She was without the coat and the office clothes and the armor of the professional world, but she was not diminished. She looked, if anything, more precisely herself, more simply who she was. She saw him and went very still. "Michael," she said, the way someone says a name when they have been both hoping and dreading that this exact thing would happen. He pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down in the unhurried way of someone who has thought about the next few minutes and decided that rushing them would be wrong. "You paid forward 8 days of pastries," he said. A brief pause. "I didn't know exactly when." She stopped. "You could have told me." "I didn't want to." She looked at the window. "I've learned to be careful about the connections I let people form with me. Specifically, with..." She paused. "With people I might not be able to stay." "What is it?" he asked. Not the sharp interrogation of someone demanding disclosure, but the quiet question of someone who has made room for whatever the answer is. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My heart. There's a structural issue they've known about for about a year. It's manageable." That's the word they use. They're managing it. A small, precise exhale. "I have surgeries ahead. Recovery. A lot of time in rooms like this one." He nodded slowly. "I didn't want Ella." To her voice adjusted slightly. "She reminds me very much of myself at that age. The drawings. The way she watches things. Her mother left when she was very young too. I didn't want her to get attached and then have me become another. I didn't want to be another absence in her life." The room was quiet. Outside the window, the city moved with its ordinary indifference. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the way he sometimes sat in the early mornings before the bakery opened when he was working through something that required stillness. "Charlotte," he said, "disappearing without a word is what creates absence. You were already there. You were already in her drawings." He let that land before he continued. Ella's mother left without saying anything. That's the part Ella carries. Not the leaving. The silence. Charlotte turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright with something she was clearly deciding whether to release or contain. It's not fair to her, she said. Forming a bond with someone who might not— That's true of everyone, he said. That's just what bonds are. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back without pressure, the way he had learned to look at things that needed time rather than force. Something in her face shifted. Not collapse. She was not the kind of person who collapsed, but the careful, deliberate lowering of something she had been holding up for a very long time. I came, she said finally, quietly, because the bakery reminded me of something. My father used to take me to a place like it when I was small. Before he got sick. Saturday mornings. The same table every time. She looked down at her hands. He died when I was 28. I haven't been able to sit in a place like that since. And then I walked past yours one morning and something in the light I just walked in. She paused. I told myself it was the coffee. Michael looked at the woman who had sat at his window table every morning for 2 months and carried all of this inside the careful container of her silence. And he felt something that was not pity and not quite tenderness, but occupied the territory between them. The table's still there, he said. Nobody else sits at it. She looked at him. We'd like you to come back, he said. Both of us. That's all. She came back on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after she had last walked through the door. The bell made its small sound. Ella looked up from her corner with the unhurried recognition of someone for whom this was merely the arrival of something that was always going to arrive. She closed her sketchbook, set it on the table, and walked across the bakery floor with her characteristic economy of motion and threw her arms around Charlotte's waist. Charlotte's hands came up slowly, the movement of someone who has not been held in a long time and has briefly forgotten how to receive it, and then settled against Ella's back with a quietness that had nothing performed in it. Michael watched from behind the counter. He held the cup he had already prepared and did not look away. Charlotte stayed. She ate her honey cinnamon pastry at the table by the window, and the morning light came through at its usual angle, and the steam from the coffee moved upward in its unhurried spiral, and nothing was the same as it had been before she had stopped coming, and nothing dramatic needed to be said about that. She came back the following morning. And the morning after that, she was thinner than before, and there was a carefulness in how she moved that was new, the particular caution of a body in negotiation with recovery. But she sat straight. She watched the street. She accepted the second cup of coffee when Michael offered it, which she had begun doing now without hesitation. Ella showed her the sketchbook. Inside, tucked between drawings of cracks and pigeons and the specific quality of morning light, was a page Ella had filled during the weeks Charlotte was gone. The table by the window, empty. The chair pushed in precisely. The morning light falling on no one. Charlotte looked at the drawing for a long time. You kept the chair, she said. Dad said it was waiting, Ella told her. Charlotte looked up at Michael across the length of the small bakery, across the distance of everything that had been said and not said, and Michael looked back at her from behind the counter with flour on his hands and the morning warmth of the ovens behind him, and neither of them said anything more about it. There was no declaration. There was no neat summation. There was only the fact of Charlotte at the window table and Ella in her corner, and the morning going on around them in its ordinary, irreplaceable way. Later, after the breakfast rush had cleared and the bakery had settled into its mid-morning quiet, Charlotte remained. She had her laptop open but wasn't looking at it. She was watching a pigeon on the ledge outside with the focused attention of someone who has recently been reminded that windows are worth looking through. Michael came around the counter and began clearing tables, and when he reached hers, she shifted her coffee slightly to one side, without being asked, to give him room, the small automatic courtesy of someone making space as a reflex rather than a gesture. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But something had changed in the air between them, some reordering of the ordinary distance that people maintain when they are not yet sure what they are to each other and are, for the first time, seriously considering the question. It was not love yet. Love requires more time than this, more of the ordinary texture of days laid down side by side. But it was something with the quality of a beginning, The kind of beginning that doesn't announce itself but simply appears, one morning, in the space where an empty chair used to be. There were things still ahead of both of them that they did not discuss and perhaps could not yet. There were surgeries on Charlotte's schedule and long recoveries, and a medical uncertainty that would not resolve neatly, because medical uncertainty rarely does. There were Ella's questions, which would grow more specific as she grew older. There were the ordinary complications of two people with separate lives and separate histories and separate wounds finding themselves at the same window table, asking whether the warmth between them is something to trust. But all of that was later. Now, there was only this. A Tuesday morning in the bakery. The particular quality of light through old glass. A child doing what she loved in her corner. A man behind his counter, and a woman at the table by the window with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had been waiting for her before she arrived. The bell above the door rang as a new customer entered, and Michael turned, and behind him Charlotte reached absently for her coffee, and Ella in her corner began a new drawing, and the morning light continued to come through the window at exactly the angle it always had, warming everything it touched without asking permission or making promises. Just present. Just this. Just the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet, and neither of them, for the first time in a long time, needed to name.